sessions so that people we can post them later on Google Classrooms and whatnot, and allow people to, to hear all of the great sharing that is being taken place. So I'd like to introduce Isaac Murdoch. I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit more, Isaac, and talk about yourself. And what I'm going to do, I have some questions that some students have sent in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to monitor the chat box. And if people have questions as Isaac is talking, put them in the chat box and I'll try to keep up with the questions, and then we can go from there. How does that sound? Sound good?
Sounds really good.
Okay, well, I'll turn it over to you, Isaac, for being here.
Naho, miigwech. First off, I just want to thank Troy and all of the organizers that put this together. And I want to thank the students that are here taking the time to listen and to maybe learn a little bit. I always find myself learning as well every time we do one of these. And so, through this transfer of knowledge, our hopes is to make the world just a little bit better and maybe ourselves a little bit better. And so I just want to take the time to give thanks and to give gratitude for this opportunity to share with each other. Mandrap kinige go na be bam gish condition cause. Kine be cook should be guys watten don't jaba. Ginoje gigo and do them and the snobby and dow. Object we bescabing in the snobbeck Adswa Nikia. My name is Isaac Murdoch. I'm from Serpent River First Nation, and I'm from the Fish Clan, and I'm Ojibwe. And I'm very thankful and I'm very happy to be here. As a child, I lived my life in the forest, and so we were hunters and gatherers. We traveled from lake to lake. We went from village site to village site in the forest. And these little village sites were small. And they usually were like 3 or 4 families. And they were very isolated. And I remember as a child, growing up in the bush, the magic that's there. Because the old people would always talk about, serpents. They believed that these serpents lived underneath the ground and they had tunnel systems. They believed in the mermaids, that mermaids lived at certain places. That, we had little people. We had Pahisak, the Memegwesiwak. We had the Bagajininiwak. We had the Pagawagaminik. We had all these different types of little people that we knew lived in the forest. And we knew where they lived. Of course, there was thunderbirds. There was, all sorts of forest dwellers that lived in the forest that were not human, and that they were very spiritual beings, like Ichisabe, Bagak, Chabayabus. There was all these spirits. And so growing up, the land was full of spirit. It was full of life. And as we weaved in our lives across those lands, we always made our offerings and our petitions to those places where they lived. Because in our culture, we believe that we were lowered down here onto the earth. That's what Anishinaabe means. It means to be lowered down. And so we know we come from the star world. Anungo Kaning, that's where we come from. And they say that when we come here, we go through 4 powers to get here, 4 sacred powers. The first power that we go to, of course, is power of the earth. That's the first power. And then once we understand the power of earth, then we go to the power of fire. Then we go to the power of wind. And the last power we go through is water, which is in our mama's belly. And we go through her sacred hoop, and we enter this great lodge of life here. And they say that we're only visitors here, that we're only here for a little bit and then we go back up to the stars. And so as guests, it's in good form and good taste and respect that we respect and treat the lands and waters, very, very carefully. We tread lightly. And so for our shoes, our moccasins, we put flowers on there to remind us that we have to walk lightly and we have to be careful where we walk. And so our lives was based on the environment. And for our people, there is no difference between economy and ecology. It's the same thing. Just think of like an animal. Their economy or their way of life to support themselves is the ecology. And it needs to have diversity, because when you have a diverse ecosystem, everything helps each other. And so as Anishinaabeg people, we understood that. We got that education from the land. And so we know that our sustainable economies depend on vibrant, alive, spiritual ecosystems. And that's how I grew up. It was a very beautiful, beautiful life. Of course, when I was 5 years old, I was taken away by Indian agents. And of course, they wanted to clear the land of indigenous people. They viewed us as the Indian problem. We were the Indian problem because we had our own language. We had our own songs and dance, which they thought could lead to rebellion. We had our own laws. We had our own government that was led by the animals. And of course, we had our own very beautiful and incredible way of life that was on the land. And so the government felt that we were too connected to the land and they needed to force us off. And so they demonized us, they villainized us, made us feel less than, erased our history, and started to force us through colonization. And so when I was 5 years old, me and my brothers, Mike, Frank, and Scott, were taken by Indian agents. And this was the colonization project. And this was all to clear Indians from the land so that there could be a free-for-all in resource extraction in our territories. And so that's what happened. Later in life, I returned back home, and I started to connect back with my grandparents. I never seen my dad till I was about 20. Our family was broken up quite a bit. It was fractured. The impacts of residential school had huge implications on our family. My daughter, Wabigwan, I just love her to pieces. She's 7 years old, and she's the first child in my bloodline that has not been taken away by Indian agents in over 120 years. And so there's been a lot that our family has gone through, but we're still here, and we're still practicing our culture, our language, and we understand that the colonial experiment has failed drastically. Not just humans, but virtually every living thing on the planet. And that the westernization or the globalization of Western education has wiped out indigenous knowledges en masse all over the world. And so getting back to our languages, getting back to land-based knowledge is critical for our survival, because that's where we're going to learn about diversity, not only with ecosystems, but amongst each other. And that's where we're going to learn about sustainable economy. Western education has not been able to produce a sustainable economy. And this is going to take the indigenous peoples of the world to bring that up. And I want to share something else. I mean, it doesn't matter what race you come from, what background you come from. You're indigenous to this earth. And when you look back far enough into your history, your people too lived their life without a garbage can. Your people too had original instructions on how to live here and had the code on how to, maintain the ecological balance on this earth. And so, I encourage everybody to find your songs, your cultural songs, your dances, and bring those up, because there's so much knowledge in there, and the language, and our languages, there's so much knowledge in there. And during a time of ecological collapse and climate change, it's very critical that we start rekindling these traditional knowledges all over the earth. And so diversity is very critical at this time. We cannot all morph into one type of human being. We need to celebrate our diversity and lift each other up. And we need that traditional knowledge to come out. So for my people, there's a movement where we're trying to get back to our traditional ways of living, because we know that there's a lot of medicine there. We know that there's a lot of life there. And it's something that's very important to us, and it's very sacred to us. So that's my introduction. Is there any questions?
Oh, are there ever? I'm sure. I encourage people to write them in the chat box again, but I certainly know that I have a few that were sent to me ahead of time, and some of them are around. You kind of touched on your clan and where that are. I think maybe, Isaac, if you could explain, there was a question specifically around how many clans do the Ojibwe have? And in addition to that, maybe you could explain what the role is of the clan and what the different meanings are. So we'll start there, and but maybe I'll say maybe you can talk a little bit more about identity. You were touching on it there, so maybe you can go with that.
Awesome. So our clan system for the Anishinaabeg people arrived to us during time of great turmoil. And so they say that it was during a time when we were warring with each other that the spirits came and helped us. And these animals came up from the earth, and they each provided us with instructions, and those became our relatives. And so our clan system is our government, and it's run by animals, because we know that the animals will always maintain the sacred instructions, the original instructions of the earth. And so as long as we're being led by the animals, then we know that we won't stray far from the trail. And so for our clan system in the Ojibwe nation, there's many. And so there's, probably, I think the last time I counted, there was about 22 or 23 clans. And all of them have different responsibilities. And so when you go to each region or each community, it may vary or different based on their teachings and their stories. But it's relatively all very familiar. For example, I'm Fish Clan. And so as Fish Clan, I'm a stargazer, I'm a philosopher, I'm a thinker, I'm a storyteller, I'm a record holder or a record keeper of knowledge, and I'm supposed to be a ceremonialist. And so that's my job as Fish Clan. And of course, to protect the lands and waters. All of our clans have that inherent responsibility to protect the waters, to protect the lands. That's part of our identity as a human being, not just as an indigenous person, but as a human being. Part of our responsibility is to make sure that the ecosystems are okay, that our water systems are good, that our diversity is well in the forest, and that there's not deforestation happening. Right now half of the trees have been cut down. And so our identity as Anishinaabeg is because we are weaved into the forest. We're part of that blanket that lives out there, that green blanket. We're kind of weaved into that, and we're connected to all of it. And so everything has a responsibility to everything, because everything gives everything to everything. And as Anishinaabeg people, that's our job too. is to protect the lands and waters. As Anishinaabeg people, we know we come from the stars and that we're only visitors here. And so identity-wise, we know that as guests, as visitors, we have great responsibilities and obligations here on this earth, and that the land depends on generosity and kindness and respect, and it depends on people to get along with each other. You know, for my people, our identity is rooted deeply into the land, into the sky, into the clouds. You know, it's deeply connected to everything around us, into the universe. And so we know that one day when we pass on, we'll go back up there, and that's where we come from, and that's our home. And so we believe that this world here is a sacred lodge that we just enter, and it's a gift. We enter this gift, and then we go back. And part of the gift is the responsibility to help others and to not be stingy or greedy. And so that's part of our Anishinaabeg identity. That's a really good question. Deadly question. If you have more questions, I'd be more than willing to help.
I have to remember to unmute my mic so you can hear me when I say, yeah, that's a great, that was a great question. And I really appreciate you taking the time to answer that. There's a lot of, you know, you touched on storytelling earlier in your introduction, and that as part of your responsibilities, that is one of your responsibilities. So a lot of students are studying Indigenous voices, and storytelling is such a big part of who we are as Indigenous people. But as a storyteller, could you talk about that, like the importance of it? And then there is a second question to that. The stories that you were told as a child, obviously you've learned them, but do you find that the variations of the stories you've been told lose their meaning over time? So maybe you can talk about those things.
Sure. You know, years ago, there used to be storytellers, and they used to call them Otsaquanine or Otsaquaniniwak. And they would travel from community to community, and they were very respected people. They were good orators. They knew how to talk well, and people loved hearing their stories. And they had a whole bunch of them, and that was their life, is they would go from community to community and tell stories. And the word for those is Atsukanan, which means spirit words or spirit talkings. And so the stories are important and vital for our education because they start to, you know, connect us to the land in a deeper and spiritual way. So knowing the history, the stories of plants, the origin stories of different trees or animals, you know, the creation stories, you know, the stories of our ceremonies, all of those things provide us with a deeper knowledge and understanding of our life here on the land. And so the stories is really part of our education. And so when we hear Otsakan, when we hear these sacred stories, we actually feast the characters in the stories. And so oftentimes when I do storytelling, it's actually ceremony. So I'll come out there, I'll bring my pipe, I'll bring my offering dish, and as I'm telling the stories, I'll feast the different spirits and the different things that I'm talking about. And I'll make a feast dish. And then after I'm done telling the stories, that will go into the fire. Because we know that when we talk about our relatives like that they come visit us. And that those stories are helping us. And we're taking something. So it's only fair that we give something back to those Manaduag, those spirits that have come to help us. And so for us, the stories are very spiritual. And the stories were often painted on rocks. They call them Muznabiganan, or they were painted on birch bark or scribed on birch bark, mazaninan, which they call. They were told through sign language, or they were told through Anishinaabemowin, Ojibwe-Moan, our language, our words. And I find that, most storytellers will tell the story the same way they heard it, and they'll never falter from that. They'll continue on with telling it the same way, so that the next generation will find it the same way that they found it, so that we don't lose any integrity or we don't lose any pieces of it. Some of the stories, as you know, are quite long. Some of the stories can take 4 days to tell. And so we do have some long stories, but they're actual ceremonial gatherings where these teachings are told. The stories are an important part of our upbringing, and because they help us understand the ecological code and the spiritual code to live here on earth. That's a very good question. Thank you.
So we have another question here. I'm bouncing back between screens and whatnot. In what way does your lived experience inform your work? And can you provide some specific examples?
I don't know what that means. You have to rephrase it.
Well, you grew up considerably different than a lot of other people, and I think the question is more around, so how has that impacted who you are as an Anishinaabe person today?
Well, I remember because when I was younger, I only had a grade 5 education, and my mother was gone. I was with my grandparents, and so I had to work. At a young age, I had to start working in the bush. I had to help my grandparents. And as I got a little bit older, they sent me to go live with medicine people to learn about the plants and the remedies and the stories and those types of things. And so that's where I got my education from. And it was through that land-based education that I was able to provide for my own self. So I'd fish and I'd hunt, and I'd make maple syrup, and I'd go wild rice harvesting, and do all sorts of fun stuff to keep myself alive. At that time, because I only had a grade 5 education, nobody was ever going to hire me, so I could never get a job anywhere, and so I was left in the forest, which I wanted anyway, to be able to live. And of course, I learned how to make birch bark canoes. I learned how to brain tan moose hides and deer hides and all sorts of things. And then all of a sudden a shift happened. Everybody's like, hey, this guy over here, he can tell some pretty neat stories. This guy over there, he made a canoe. This guy, he's brain tanning deer hides. We need to get that guy. And so because of my education that I received as a child and as a teenager, as I grew into an adult, people started to recognize that land-based traditional education was critical for our survival. And people started to hire me. People would say, a lot of Indians from all over would say, hey, come to the band office and do a talk. Or come over here and build a canoe. Come over here and do a culture camp. Come over here and tell some stories. And before you know it, I found myself traveling all over the world. I'm doing this. And of course, I became an artist, and I started to get the art out as well. And so the art that I do is based on a lot of the stories and the imagery that I've seen on pictographs and things like that. And so I started to become an artist. And I've been very fortunate as an artist. So like people like Joaquin Phoenix tweeted my art, Jane Fonda, Leonardo DiCaprio, Bruno Mars, my art's like with the Black Eyed Peas, The Dalai Lama has bought my art, Kevin Costner. And so as an artist, I've been very lucky as well. So as a storyteller, artist slash bushman, my education that I received in the bush has really paid off. And so I have amazing opportunities now as a result of that Indigenous education that I received as a child. But really good question.
And a lot of people would say that, you were at a disadvantage because you didn't have that formal education, right? So, I can't stop smiling because my son follows this guy and he always says, "Ever deadly." You're so deadly. But yeah, just when you said, "Hey, look at that guy over there," it just reminded me. So it just made me laugh. Isaac,
Right.
it's so important. All of these things are so important. And I know on Tuesday when we do this again, we're going to really be, kind of going into a little bit more about what you just touched on with your influences, your artwork, and all of those pieces. But I wondered if you kind of touched on it a little bit. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, the revitalization that's happening in our communities and the importance of that.
Absolutely. So we know that there was an erasure of our culture and our history on purpose that was fueled by the Canadian government. And so when, we were erased from the maps, we were erased from the textbooks, we were erased from, our histories were erased, our places, our names, our languages were systematically erased so that our lands could be stolen. And so we know that this took place and that it wasn't right. There was a genocide that happened against our people. But I remember when I was a child, the old people were still doing ceremonies in the house. They were having like little sweat lodges underneath the tables, and they were still living in fear because of what was happening. And I believe it was probably in the late 70s when there was a rebirth or a rekindling of our culture and language, where people really started to pick it up again. And they started to say, you know what, we need to preserve these things. At the same time, there was this huge promotion that education was the new buffalo. And my grandparents always said, no, the buffalo will always be our education. And that the natural laws here is what governs everything. And that man-made laws and ideas, if we put them higher than natural law, and the great education that this land gives us, the world will fall apart. And so, our people start to recognize that, you know what, maybe we need to invest more into our culture and our languages, because nobody was speaking the native languages, really. And so there is a rebirth, a rekindling of those things to bring them back. The gardening and the hunting and the knowledge trading, and of course the valuable information about the treaties, the Godot Naganana, the dish with one spoon. All of these things start to come back, and we start to see our people unified together through ceremony and language, because we know that without those things, we probably won't survive as a human species. That we need to have this organic, traditional, diverse knowledge, from all over the world to survive.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was going to ask you, because a lot of the students who are on the call with us today are non-Indigenous and they're teachers. And I guess, how does the revitalization of Indigenous cultures, why is it important for them to know that?
Well, I think that, like, say if I came from Ireland, right? So I would be Indigenous from Ireland, and the Irish have an amazing beautiful history that predates colonialism. So when you go to Ireland, there's amazing stuff going on there. I remember they found this bog in Ireland, and this bog is like filled with methane gas, and it actually preserved the body of this Irishman. And he was buried, and I guess there was some sort of waterway moved in, and he was preserved. But they took his body out, and wouldn't you know, he was covered with feathers. He was covered with tattoos. He had the symbols the same as us. He believed like us. He was living like us. And so I think that every race of people have that connection to the earth. I think what's really special here in Turtle Island is that the indigenous people here have the traditional knowledge on how to live here. And so, for example, if I was in Ireland, I would rely on the people in Ireland to teach me how to live there sustainably. So over here, it's important that non-Indigenous people, take the time to learn about these lands here and how to live here. And when we do this together, when we do this out of respect and mutual friendship, we actually create something very beautiful. And that's something that we need to do, is we need to create beautiful, and we need to come together as one and unify for the lands and waters here. And of course, I think that everybody plays a role in that. And so I think that, again, coming together and lifting each other up and building each other up and not making anybody feel less than is very important. Because we know as Indigenous people, we were made to feel less than for a long time. And so, it's only fair. We know how that feels like. And so we have to, of course, be mindful of our relationship with everybody. Yes, there was a genocide, but at the same time, we're going through a massive ecological collapse, and we're in abrupt climate change. And so we have to find constructive ways to work together to save the planet, and we can do it. And I believe that it's going to be young people that are going to do it, because it's older people like me, that are probably not going to start a revolution. It's always the young people, when they gather in mass, when they gather, by the thousands and thousands, nobody can stop them. Teachers can't stop them, parents can't stop them, police can't stop them, armies can't stop them, nobody can stop them. Especially when it's a revolution of the heart. Nobody wants to stop them. That's the thing. And that's when real change happens, is when the young people rise up and they actually demand and they make a better world. And so I know I've kind of deviated off the topic, but
no, it leads right into something else that one of the students had posed, because there's been some activism not too long ago about the pipeline, right? And I know that you're extremely invested from an environmental and Indigenous perspective. And the question was, why do you think, or I guess you could just speak to that, because there was a lot of young people, there was a lot of Indigenous people there. Never had we seen the amount of people supporting the opposition to a pipeline like we did not long ago.
Well, I think when we just look at the scientific facts, when we look at the science, you have the tar sands, which are proposing to extract 4 trillion barrels of fossil fuels to market. And these fossil fuels will be turned into plastics. They will be turned into gasoline or oil or different products, and a lot of it will go into the atmosphere. So the issue so much isn't the pipelines, it's the fact that 4 trillion barrels of pollution is going to go into the sky during abrupt climate change. That's the real problem. And so people are seeing pipelines as a way to stop it from happening. And so a lot of people are saying, you know what? No, we have the technology to make change. We have the technology to do something different. And we need to start using it. And that there's a huge economic stimulus when we convert over to this other technology. And it's going to completely revolutionize the energy sector. And that we should start moving towards green, sustainable energy now. And we know that it's just, you know, there's a cash crop to be made with oil extraction, with fossil fuel development. And that's what the real issue is. And so the young people are saying, no, we're standing up. And so during a lot of the recent activity, what we were seeing was nations of people were saying, you do not have our consent, which is different than activism or protests. So the media or governments will say those are radical protesters, but they're not. Those are human beings that want to have a future and have a life. Those are nations that are saying you do not have our consent. And so that's different. So they rationalize, or they make our things smaller by the words they use. But we know that our indigenous people are going to unite. And when our nations join together, you know, and good, you know, using good medicine, that has become strong. And I want to make a point. So if I'm against a pipeline, right, and I'm all mad and I'm against the pipeline, and I start fighting the pipeline, I may get some supporters. I may get some people that will want to help, and you know, I may get quite a few of them. But that's not as powerful as being for a river. So if I'm for a river, everybody can be a part of it. Grandmothers, children, teachers, students, moms, babies. Everybody can be a part of being for a river. And so when you're trying to protect a river, that becomes so much more powerful than trying to take down a pipeline. So, you know, trying to tear down something ugly, it creates ugly. And you're not going to have the momentum or the support that's needed. But if you're creating beautiful for beautiful, then everybody will be a part of it, and it becomes infectious because it feels good. And, you know, you get more numbers. And so nonviolent actions are definitely more successful. So they've done studies on this, and I've studied revolution. You know, so I've been to, you know, several places all over the world and studied revolution to find out what's the most successful. And it's always being for something as opposed to being against something that makes the success high. And of course, being nonviolent. And it's always young people, because young people have the energy. The young people are the ones that have the stuff. You know, adults are stuck to policies and legislation and bills and mortgages and, you know, and all of this stuff. They don't have the freedom, you know, to be able to get out there. Young people, they got free range, you know. So that's why when the young people were starting to get active, there was nothing nobody could do. And nobody wanted to do anything because they knew that the future is theirs, and they have an opportunity and a responsibility to be involved. And as adults and as teachers and as leaders, we have to make sure that they're stewards of the movement, and that they're the ones leading the way, and that, you know, we guide them, you know, with our wisdom and our good knowledge and our support and our ceremonies and so forth. But it's a big issue, and it's an issue that'll continue. It's an issue that I'll continue to be involved with, and it's an issue that I think is probably the most pressing issue on the planet, is climate change. And there is hope. I mean, just look at COVID-19. As soon as everybody was in lockdown and like wasn't going to the store like crazy, like the things like ozone holes actually start to close up. Like this person in Los Angeles, it was the first time in their whole entire lives that they actually seen stars in the middle of Los Angeles. And so we know that we could do this. So COVID-19, this is really an opportunity for us to look at ourselves, reflect at how we're living, so that we can make better changes for the future. We could do everything that we just did without COVID-19. And so it takes discipline, and it's going to take young people to band together to demand that change and to make it happen. And as adults, we need to support them, get behind them, and back them up 100%. No question. And that's a good question.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah, no, that's good, and I appreciate that. I recognizing that we've gone probably a little bit longer as I knew we would, and we still have lots to talk about. But I guess we're lucky, Isaac, that we have you coming back on Tuesday. So unless there's any other questions that people have that are kind of those burning questions right now, I can maybe say we can hold off until Tuesday, when we're going to look a little bit more at your art and your influences, talk a little bit more about the environment. And I know you speak quite a bit about Inoknagewin and that role too. So I think that's going to be a really good conversation, right?
Awesome.
And yeah, there's so many things that connect, and there's so much that we can talk about, as you know. But I think for now, I'm going to say Niao Goa for joining us, and thank you to everyone else who have participated. If you have any questions, please just pop them in the chat box or send them to your teachers, and they can email me. And that goes for the teachers as well. If you have any questions, send me an email, and we'd be happy to forward those on and bring them up on Tuesday. So enjoy your day, everyone. And again, thanks a lot, Isaac. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. It
Yeah.
was a great honor to be here today. So, Bama Pigwab Min Minwa Nahao Miigwech. Thank you very much.